Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast. That's a mouthful, I know, but at least we're being honest. In this episode, we're handling Genesis chapter 10. And welcome back, Mike. I hear you're preaching tomorrow. What's that about? What's that on?
So our church has been doing a series in prayer, and the angle we were taking was to actually talk about different kinds of prayer. And so tomorrow's the last sermon on it. It's also going to be Palm Sunday. So the most appropriate thing for me to talk about is imprecatory and lament prayer.
Oh, there you go.
And so it's going to be interesting. I'm still working on it, but it does play off of some of the research and material that I had studied in the book of Job, and really just the general practice and the importance of properly lamenting and properly even praying angry prayers at times to God.
Yeah.
Especially when
I'd recommend Reflections on the Psalms by C.S. Lewis, by the way, if you have time. I know you're preaching tomorrow, so I'm sure you hate getting last-second recommendations. I've been totally blessed over the years by Lewis's thoughts on praise and lament in his Reflections on the Psalms little books. So,
well, if anything, I would also I have been reading on and off. Has been this book by Samuel Ballantine, the Prayer in the Hebrew Bible. He's a Job scholar, and I mean he basically just dives right into wisdom literature as well. And another book that I read for the sermon research is called Jesus Wept by Rebecca Elmwood. It's incredible material. She talks about how lament and imprecatory prayer is still relevant in New Testament times and beyond, because of how, in her view, the New Testament writers basically took lament prayers and wrapped it into the eschatological vision, or into the already and not yet, that they're still valid because we're still waiting for the culmination of the kingdom. And so but we have an endpoint we're looking forward to. And so it even makes the laments and the laments we do in our own lives even more vital, because we're essentially reminding ourselves of that hope that we're waiting for Jesus to come back.
Yeah, beautiful. I wrote that in one of the margins. In fact, right in my Psalms opening page of my margin. We are practicing in the Psalms the lines that will someday be ours to read when the author invites us to take our role on the stage. And I don't know who said that. I'm going to claim it for my own. Pretend I said that. But to me, that's what the Psalms are, including the laments, including the imprecations. Even it's listening. It's like standing on the side of the stage of the play. You have your lines. You're ready to go on later, and you hear people out there on the stage saying things, and you're looking at your script, saying, "Boy, that doesn't sound like my script at all." Right? But then you realize, hey, the director, the screenwriter, they know what they're doing. So my role is to say my lines when I get out on stage. And but you can learn. That's, to me, how the Psalms can be understood and appreciated. I mean, these people are saying things like, my God, why have you forsaken me? That were pretty hot. That's hot stuff, right? And yet, Jesus will say, pray for your enemy, and the Psalms are asking for their death, right? So how do you put those two together? To me, the standing on the side of the wings of the play analogy, at least, works a little bit to help me realize my lines may not be theirs, but I'm learning from them as they talk. So
yeah, and
well, best wishes on your sermon. Hope it goes well.
Well, if anything, I could say one last thing was the fact you brought up, my God, that's actually the sermon that I'm going to be basing it off on, is Psalm 22, and how the different portions in the Psalm, it's like as though you're having a dialogue amongst different people within the congregation. You have the actual people who are lamenting, but then you have also one scholar called them the theologians of glory, the people who are mocking the sufferer. But then ultimately, in the end, the vindication comes from both God and the congregation, that there will be a deliverance for the sufferers, and all this in a communal setting.
Psalm 22 ends victoriously, which is shocking. The way it starts out, so negative, my goodness. And then you end up, by the time you're done, you're realizing this is the way you talk to God, right? Yahweh. I mean, you wouldn't talk to Baal this way. You wouldn't talk to Molech this way, but you can talk to God this way, or Yahweh this way, because he is the kind of God who loves to hear his own people be honest.
Yeah.
And Boy, cool. Well, let's jump in. We are going to start in Genesis 10. We never finished Genesis 9 last time, so I think and it's important. So I'm going to begin in Genesis 9:18 with Noah getting off the ark. He's got 3 sons and 3 daughters-in-law. So 9:18 reads, "Now the sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth." And notice it then adds this line, Ham was the father of Canaan. That's, again, good evidence. That's the first occurrence of the name Canaan in the Bible. Mm-hmm. He's the son of Ham. Now, why would the text stop and say, by the way, Ham, one of the 3 sons of Noah, was the father of Canaan? To me, that's an example of where the writer is knowing that this stuff is already known. This story must have been famous, and even Canaan must have been famous already, so that the writer is saying, this is the guy that you already know. So I think that's just telling us, watch for the man Canaan later. Okay. Mm-hmm. You get off, and again, jump in, Mike, wherever you want. To the listener, again, we don't rehearse this. This is all done on the fly. And so Mike has the responsibility to interrupt me.
So if I would say anything, like I would agree. Yes, we want to watch out for Canaan. But I think, like, I also treat this as, like, because we were just talking about, like, a play, right? Play metaphor. So this is almost foreshadowing. Like it's like
Absolutely.
Chekhov's gun. You don't, like, it's going to be used. Yeah. You know it's going to be used in this narrative. You just don't know how.
Very good, yeah. I've got on my Bible, my printed version in front of me, I've got the word in 9:18, Canaan, circled, and then I've got lines going everywhere from there. So yeah, good. This is like that gun. For me, it's like the gun on the mantle of the novel. It's like in chapter 3, there's this gun, and you're waiting for the gun to be used. So anyway, Canaan's the guy that we want to watch for. So let's do that. Verse 19, these were the 3 sons of Noah. And again, from the whole earth, this is the group that now will populate the whole earth. Then you have, and I'm not going to read it, but 20 and 21, Noah gets drunk. Ham in 22, notice again it says the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers. Shem and Japheth took a garment, verse 23, put it on their shoulders, walked backwards, and they covered the nakedness of their father. Now, as to what he did, there's debate. I mean, the Jewish tradition, whether it be the rabbis or the midrash, they have different ideas. Some it's incest, rape, maybe it's just viewing the father. So whatever it is, it's verse 24, and jump in, Mike, with your thoughts. But verse 24, the key is verse 24, when Noah awoke from his wine. And here's the line, knew what his youngest son had done to him. And the text in Hebrew is clear. He did something to him. So that's why most academicians today think that there was some action of Ham upon his father.
Yeah. And if anything, if I could interject about this part, this was something I remember Mike had, like Dr. Heiser had addressed in, I think it was like episode 159. And he was talking about Noah's nakedness, and he brought up this paper. I read it years ago. It was excellent. It was by these 2 guys, John Bergsma and Scott Walker Hahn. It's called Noah's Nakedness and the Curse on Canaan. It's an article from the JBL, or Journal of Biblical Literature. Mm-hmm. Essentially, they propose, and they talked about all those kind of possibilities you mentioned, Ron, of, like, was it simply viewing? Was it incest? Some sort of rape, maybe? And they proposed the idea that what Ham had done to Noah was not directly on Noah, but on Noah's wife.
Yeah, I've heard that view. Yeah.
Yeah. And
uncovering the nakedness can mean, in Leviticus, having relations with a man's wife.
Yeah. So, and vice versa. Though the wife's nakedness is the husband. And so there's something weird that is going on. And their proposal is that Ham had essentially, while Noah was down and out because he was drunk and sleeping, that Ham attacked his mother. And the idea being that he impregnated her, and that the result of that impregnation is Canaan. And thus,
interesting.
Ham being not the oldest son, that this was like a common practice in ancient Near Eastern cultures, where if you're not the oldest son, you're not going to be in charge of the family after your father passes away.
Right.
So how do you bypass that? Is by setting up a rival firstborn through your mother, through the wife of your father. And
well, whatever he did,
yeah, it's just messed up. It's just really messed up.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that example of the rabbit hole that the Bible gives us every now and then to go down, and it's not wasted time. That's the beauty of it. This is always, for me, and I know for you, the deeper you want to study, or let's use the analogy of you're on a road and you can sit down and study the gravel. You can study it as deeply as you want to, and you're going to learn about your road, right? And that's what we're doing here. So thank you. I'm going to move on and just go with what the text does to not Ham. This is what's interesting. Mm-hmm. Again, look at verse 25. When Noah awoke, verse 25, he says, "Cursed be," and you'd expect the word Ham there, but he doesn't. He goes after Canaan. Canaan is the son. Now, maybe Canaan is the offspring, as you just mentioned there, that maybe Canaan is the child that comes from this illicit union. We don't know, but for sure, notice where this goes. "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be. And he said," now here's where this is my recommendation. Again, I give my view, and you're welcome to think about it and help me, pull me back from the edge of the cliff. Notice where the other side goes. And in biblical parallelism, you can often tell what the first line means by what the second line means. And here's the way it goes. "Blessed be," and you'd expect, as opposed to the curse on Canaan, you'd expect a blessed be, and pointing to a child or someone else. But he goes to Yahweh. "Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem." So I think this is more than just a story of a human to human issue. This would be, back to Dr. Mike's appeal in fact, it's the subtitle of his Unseen Realm, a supernatural worldview of the Bible. That means look for the vertical story as often as you can. And I think this is a vertical issue here. "Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem," which implies, back to verse 25, that Canaan and even Ham are not worshiping Yahweh. Because the blessing cursing is not just between humans, it's actually between the gods that these humans probably worship. So again, I hope I'm not reading into that, but when he says, "Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem," now you're learning that Shem is the guy of the three that probably worships Yahweh. And that's why then you get the Canaan and Japheth thing going even at the end of the verse. So that's all I'm going to say about chapter 9, because hang on for Canaan, he's coming back. But I think, again, at the end of 9, you get a story that's vertical about which God these people are worshiping or not, as we did at the end of 4. Remember when we said that the Cain and Abel story, as interesting as it is, it ends with Seth and his children worshiping Yahweh, and the text wants to bring us back to the which God, the which Elohim line of thinking as often as possible. So, are we ready for 10? Anything else you want to add there?
Well, I would recommend, if anything, genealogies are going to always be a very difficult thing for folks to read.
Yep.
It's just not our culture these days. A recent resource that I had picked up is, I actually have enjoyed it a lot because it visualizes the family trees, the genealogies, in a very kind of tangible Western way. And so the book is called All the Genealogies of the Bible. It was recently released. Visual charts and...
I saw that at SBL. It's expensive, isn't it?
Well, the Logos version is definitely cheaper.
Okay.
easier to access.
I had it in my hands and I put it down. I said, I can't spring for that right now.
Yeah,
so
I got the Logos version, and they have this beautiful chart of essentially the family of Noah, all 3 sons, and then breaking down all the various grandsons of Noah and even the great grandchildren of Noah. And, if anything, I'm looking at Ham and Canaan, and it shows this whole entire thing of, one, Canaan is not the oldest of the children of Ham. He's only one of 4. And then there's this whole entire breakdown of all the descendants of Canaan. And you recognize some of these names: Hittites, Jebusites.
And let's do that. That's in 10. So we're heading that direction to figure out why in the world is Canaan so important to the story. So I think, at least again, I'll give you my opinion. So that kind of resource, there's another rabbit hole. I would love, when are we going to have the time for this, Mike? That's the problem. When do you have the theoretical sitting on the dock of your cabin, looking out across the lake and nothing to do but read? That's the goal, I suppose, for my immature mind, but I don't know when that's going to happen. But anyway, till then, let's keep going. All right, chapter 10, verse 1. Well, and again, our goal here in this podcast is just to get to the end of 10. And I know this sounds like a genealogy. My recommendation to keep the attention of the listener is that 10 and 11 together is the problem that the gospel will someday solve, that this is important stuff to them. And I know that's a huge kind of bet or, a proclamation or apodosis to say this is the problem that the gospel will solve. But I hope by the end of 11, when Abraham's about to be called, that the audience listening to this, both in Genesis and even on the podcast, will say, boy, we've got a problem here. And how is God going to solve this problem that we have in front of us? So that's my goal. All right. 10:1. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. These are the three guys who come off the ark. Notice how chapter 10 is structured. Verse 2 has the Japheth line. So 2 through 5 is Japheth. In fact, let's handle it now. Gomer, Magog, Gog and Magog are, again, that's in Ezekiel 38, and it comes up in Revelation again. I think that just means Gog and his militia kind of a thing. So there's more going on there than we have time to do now, but this is where the name first occurs. The other sons of Japheth, I don't think we need to mention, but notice verse 5. This is the summary of the sons of Japheth. From these, the coastland peoples, there's the first occurrence of the word goy in Hebrew, in the Hebrew Bible. Goy, plural goyim, translated in the New King James as Gentiles. So here's the story of where Gentiles come from. The coastland peoples spread in their lands, each, notice, with his own language by their clans in their nations. This goes to an end, the end run of 10:2 through 5 is that we have a world full of these kind of people speaking a certain language, living in their own nation. So really, we have a quick rendition of how this line from Japheth spreads for many generations. It's looking way down the road.
Yeah.
Okay?
If I could also just interject here, is that two thoughts. One, I'm now wondering if the coastline peoples is sort of like an allusion to the Philistines one day.
It is, yeah. This will be the Aegean peoples. Yeah. Generally speaking, on a big map, if you have a study Bible, it'll have it'll push the sons of Japheth off to the north and west. So you're thinking of the Mediterranean, Aegean area, which is where the Philistines come from. And what's scary about a lot of these names is that it might be a name of a person, but it's also the name of a tribe, and thus a clan or a kingdom, really. And so the biblical reader the first time is going to say, "Oh, so that's where that guy, that's where those people come from." So,
and the second thing is that if this is the first time that the word goy or goyim are being used, I think for just the benefit of folks to realize, in Hebrew there are two words that are usually used to describe like family or clan or people. For Gentiles, for non-Israelite, non-Jewish folks, we were given the word goyim and goy were used for us, and the word was used for the people of God or the Israel. And so that was always kind of the distinction as you're reading Hebrew. You could tell who the writer is talking about. Is it the Israelites or Jewish people, or is it the Gentiles?
Yeah, and it'll be hard in English to know because, as I even have noticed in my versions, if they're reading this, you can see people in one and Gentiles in the other. So it's hard to know sometimes if reading English which one it is, but good point. Verse 6 is the sons, he's backing up, starting over. These are the sons of Ham. Okay, and now you'll get the names: Cush, Egypt, Put, and there he is, Canaan, the fourth son, at least in this list, in 10:6 of the sons of Ham is Canaan. He then gives the list, again, continues on. By the way, he mentions in verse 8 a guy named Nimrod. Now, he's a famous name in Mesopotamian literature. And he's famous here too, but he doesn't say a lot about it. So 10:9, he was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter. The hunter concept has royal connotations to it in the ancient world. So you think of a hunter going out to hunt and to bring home game, as it were. The idea in the ancient world would be like a king, like David going off to war, coming back with spoils and so forth. So that might be a royal connotation, that he was a king. And in fact, verse 10 is the first use of the word kingdom in the Bible. Mamlakah, 10:10, the beginning of his kingdom was, and there you go, Babel, Babylon, same word, Babel, and Babylon. So if anything, the text is trying to hint, there you go, going forward, shall we say, watch for this guy again. The kingdom, the first kingdom, or his kingdom, was in Babel, which then at the last word of verse 10, in the land of Shinar. Shinar and Babel, of course, will come up in chapter 11. So, not that we know this, but there's, again, a lot of discussion that maybe Nimrod is one of the guys, if not the guy, who, and this is Jewish tradition, he was the builder of the Tower of Babel. It's possible. Again, we could test drive that, but we don't have very far to go, only up to chapter 11 before we have to kind of let that test drive go. So, dropping down to verse 15, we're still in the family of Ham. Notice what he does. Canaan, there's the guy. We've been waiting for him since 9:18 to reappear because he seems to be an important person. He was cursed in 9:25 by God. I don't think he's a Yahwist based on the other side of the curse, or the other side, which was a blessing upon Yahweh. So again, I think that when you hear, even as an Israelite or as a Jew during the days of Moses, the first writer of this, and then the editors going forward, when you even heard the word Canaan in 10:15, you're going to wince, because that's a bad word, right, to you. Notice where he goes with the names. Fathered Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth. And then you get for the first time not just a name of a person, but a people group. The Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, and the Hivites, and so forth. Those first four of the list, and it keeps going, are exactly the first four named in Deuteronomy 7, when God is telling through Moses Joshua about the peoples of Canaan. And when you go into Canaan, you're going to meet, quote, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites. So again, I think the first reader of this would have said to himself or herself, oh, so that's where those bad people come from that we met when we went into Canaan under Joshua's leadership. Those are guys who came from the father of Canaan. By the way, which is more evidence again that from a vertical storyline, these are non-Yahwists. These are clearly people who, when they're met by Joshua's army, they're worshiping other deities. And where does it start? It starts all the way back here, getting off the ark. Well, again, I throw it back to you, Mike, as a wonderful conversation partner here. Is it possible that Noah didn't have Yahwistic kids? In other words, we know that Noah was, but now when we read this, that Canaan, who is the grandson of Noah, he's the father of some pretty bad people. And when I say bad, I mean not just behaviorally, I mean worship-wise. They are not even following Yahweh. So at least we have, and it's a sad story in that sense, that here's again reason to think that the flood narrative of Genesis 6-9 is not just a children's story. This is setting up here we go. It's setting up the problem that Genesis 12 is about to solve, or at least be the start of the solution, right? So I have this circled in my Bible, 10:15 and 10:16 and 10:17 as here's the problem, or at least this gives me a sense of the vertical supernatural problem that we better be watching for as we go forward. Any thoughts there?
I do think this is where having the DCW, that worldview in mind, because I had never even considered Because when you just assume, even implicitly, that, well, everyone's obviously worshiping Yahweh because he's the only God, he's the only one that exists, or really the only relevant one in the story, that it almost seems kind of...
Relevance, the operative word, right?
Right. It seems kind of almost almost irrelevant of like, well, of course, like the three sons of Noah would be Yahweh's, right? Because like he's the only God that's really active right now. He's the only one that's been speaking. It's sort of like funny. It's like you never implicitly realize that maybe there is something else that's going on in the background. And so I really did appreciate you pointing out about how Shem is connected with Yahweh, as though it's implying that there is something going on with Shem, that he was different amongst the two other brothers. And that these guys are just simply, they've somehow maybe aligned themselves or were more fascinated. I just don't know. The text doesn't tell us.
It doesn't say, but at least to the Divine Council worldview, which is that's our domain, right? That we are looking at the text and we're test driving it as we go. At least I am. I know I still have to do that because I don't have this all figured out. But when I look at it that way and I say, wait a second, especially knowing a little bit of the further story down the way, Deuteronomy 7 and so forth, that there's something going on here that the reader would have known is something to watch for. So, thank you. Let's get down to the bottom of the story of Ham is verse 20. These are the sons of Ham. So here we have a second summary statement compared back to verse 5. Verse 20, these are the sons of Ham by, notice again the plurality, their clans, their languages, plural, their lands, their nations. I bet you that's goyim again. I think it is. Yep, goy. And their goyim. So that word, that negative connotation word goyim, it's being used in chapter 10 to say this is all those people that you've heard about that live out there. And by the way, this is called the Table of Nations again in most study Bibles and so forth. Jews are all over this. They think of the nations as a 70, in terms of a number of 70. Now, of course, there's more than that probably. This list doesn't think about people living potentially in Britain or in the Americas and that kind of thing. That's not the point of chapter 10, because we're arguing from we're arguing backwards or thinking backwards from a people group, the readers of this text, who were Jews, who were Israelites. And so they're concerned about, as an Israelite, how do I look at the world? And here's the list, these 70 nations, and you can add them up. The number of nations listed in chapter 10 are 70. So, and Israel's not among them. That's key. That what you have is a world full of 70 nations that are doing their thing, and that's why chapter 12 will be so important. But anyway, 5 and 20 work as summary statements for the lives of, or the generations of, Japheth and Ham.
And if anything, just to kind of bring it in, is that this is in many ways the indication of the time of how they viewed this was the known world to them, and so
true.
They would not have known about Anglo-Saxons,
right?
They would not have known about the Russians, and so they would not have thought of those folks, and just even the brilliant use of getting it down to 70 names, 7 and 10 multiplied. It's like perfection right there. It's like they're basically right. It's a number way of saying holistically everything.
Yeah, everything that they were interpreting their worldview through.
Yeah,
and especially as they had just come into Canaan at the point of the writing of this, people were poised again to make waste of Canaan. So, all right, 21. The children were born to Shem. Now let's get to that third boy of Noah, who we learned in chapter 9 is a Yahwist. So this might be, and my theory would go, that of the two boys mentioned so far, Japheth and Ham, they don't seem to be, based on the names of the people groups that they father, they don't seem to be Yahwists. Now comes a man we know to be a Yahwist, and here we go, verse 22. The sons of Shem. We're going to learn in 11:10 that he was 98 when he got off the ark. So these were all born to a 98 and on, year-old man. Okay, Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. These are names, again, that to them, Aram, the Arameans, that's over there in Assyria, that's Babylonian area. In other words, these are usually on a map, again, this will be Mesopotamian people, okay, which is, again, where Abraham will come from.
Yeah.
Then the sons of Aram were Uz and Hul. Arphaxad, let's go down his line, seems to be the point. We get Salah, and Salah begot Eber. Some people think the word Hebrew comes from Eber. Jews themselves think that that's probably it, but we don't know. To Eber were born 2 sons. Now here we go. 1025 is important to our story, and I'll show you why. In fact, let's do it now. I'm going to jump over to 1 Chronicles 1. If you have a Bible, jump over to 1 Chronicles 1, which is this is our story kind of a thing. It's a genealogy, but when it comes to, and I do it now because of Peleg, the guy named Peleg is going to be important in Genesis 10:25. But go to 1 Chronicles 1 and watch how their re-rendition of Genesis's genealogy is important to them, even in 1 Chronicles, which is probably dated to the Babylonian exile. Notice the first word, Adam. He's the guy that we run our whole worldview through. That's how a Jew thinks. Seth, specifically, he was a Yahwist. We learn that in the story of Genesis 4. Enosh, chapter 5, he walked with God. And then you go down, that's Enoch. Enosh is the guy that's in 426 of Genesis. Enoch in verse 3 of 1 Chronicles 1 is the guy that walked with God and so forth. And then you get to Noah, 1 Chronicles 1:4. There's his 3 boys, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And you get to, here's my point, you get the same general list. The sons of Japheth in verse 5, the sons of Ham in verse 8, ending with Canaan again. We have Nimrod mentioned again in verse 10, seems to be again famous. And I'm bringing us to 1 Chronicles 1 because it's a retelling and it brings up some of the same names to show that, yes, these guys were important to the Israelite history. Egypt, father, okay, then verse 13, Canaan, here he is again. This is that famous guy, fathered. And notice the list, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites. That's, bad names to a Jew. And now you get to 17, sons of Shem, Elam, Asher, Arphaxad. This is the same names we just saw in Genesis 10. But notice where it brings us to, verse 19. To Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg. Notice the next phrase, for in his days the earth was divided. I'll leave it there and go back to Genesis 10. In other words, it's important that Peleg is known for the division of the earth. So I'm back in Genesis 10:25. Let's read it again. To Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg. Hebrew, it just means to divide. It's a common verb in Hebrew to divide a river into 2, and that's just the meaning of PLG in Hebrew. So when he was born, his mom said, let's name him Division. For some reason. We don't know what mindset she had at that moment, but that was her choice. But notice how foretelling, as it were, and sometimes this happens with names in the Bible, it becomes a bit prophetic for what happens. For in his days, the earth was divided. And again, it just repeats the word divided in its verbal form. Okay. He mentions Joktan, the brother, and Joktan's children. In fact, he leaves it all there. But now, and I'm going to drop down to verse 30 and 31 just to get there, but I want to go back to that division concept because it's going to be very important. The territory, verse 30, the territory in which they lived extended from Mesha in the direction of Sephar to the hill country of the east. In a Jewish mind, they knew this was the Mesopotamian area. 31, notice how this mirrors 10:5 and 10:20. It's a summary statement for the sons of these boys, the sons of Shem, by their, here it is again, clans, languages, lands, and nations, plural. And again, we have nations, goyim there in 10:31, and you say, well, I thought we're talking about Jews. And you have to remember, not yet. Shem is not a Jew. Shem is the father of a man who someday will become the father of the Jews. But at this point in Genesis 1 through 10, we don't have any Jews yet. This is all pre-Abraham. So one more verse, and then let's go back and talk about this division, and it'll take us to the end of our time. These are the clans of the sons of Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, in their goyim. And from these, the goyim spread abroad on the earth after the flood. Okay, so the point of chapter 10 has been to give us, but it's going to be in chapter 11, 10 generations that come out of the ark. 10, 1, 2, 3, 10 different generations, one after the other, that come out of the ark after the flood. The fifth generation after the flood is back to verse 25, and his name was Peleg. We have it here and in 1 Chronicles 1, that interesting phrase, for in his day the earth was divided. All right, so let's settle in on that because, we don't have to settle in on it. The Bible does. In chapter 11, verse 1, let's just predict what we're going to do in our next podcast. Verse 1 of chapter 11 reads, "Now the whole earth was one language and the same words, or had one speech." I think what 11:1 is saying, let's go back in time to getting off the ark when everyone spoke the same language. In other words, we clearly had in chapter 10 the division of languages. So that means that 11 is taking us back in time. And I think what 11:1, and again, we'll save this for our next podcast, but the point of 11 and on, the Tower of Babel incident, is to tell us the how of the what. The what is chapter 10. We divided the earth into language groups and goyim. 11 is going to go back and say, well, here's where that famous story that we all know did its work, and it caused the people then to break off into these different groups. So, is that making sense, Mike?
It does. Generally,
11 takes us back
too, of how 11 is essentially a going backwards into explaining how did we even get to all these different clans and nation groups that are espoused out in chapter 10.
Yep. Now, let's do this because, again, it's going to be the subject of 11, but we have a few minutes before we close this one up to talk about back to 25. To Eber were born two sons. 10:25, one was Peleg. In his days, the earth was divided. I was just going over this in a Sunday school class at our church, and we're going through Genesis providentially, and it's about 24 people in a big circle, and we just read around every Sunday morning, and it's a classic Sunday, it's a Sunday school, frankly, where that's what I grew up with. That before you go to church, you go to Sunday school, and you just study the Bible. And so in this Sunday school class that I run, we just read the Bible in a big circle, and we got to verse 25 last week, and I looked up and I said to the group, so what do you think it means that in his day the earth was divided? And I expected this answer, and I got it. And he said, one of the lovely gentlemen there, an older man, he said, this is the day that Brazil cracked off from southwest Africa and the lands divided. You had continental drift. Like it was the second weekend in March. Crack. There they go. See you later, guys. And you have two continents waving goodbye to each other.
This giant landmass just floating away.
Yeah, that wasn't what he meant, but that's always been the picture since I was in grade school thinking about this. That the continental drift is this weekend event, right, where the world divided and people had to say goodbye to each other. And I said, thank you. And again, let me go back to that Sunday school class. I said, thank you. That's what I heard, again, too. But what probably happens here, and this is, again, getting into biblical studies, that let's do our work in Hebrew here. If you go to verse 32, Genesis 10:32, the last verse that sets up the question of how in chapter 11, these are the clans of the sons of Noah, according to genealogies, and from these the nations spread abroad. Now that's the ESV, but in the New King James, from these the nations were divided. Mm-hmm. Parad. It's a different Hebrew word. It's not Peleg. It's another word. If I, again on my screen, I'm playing this out in front of those that can see it on screen, but you can do this in your own time in any kind of a Hebrew, accordance or logos. Ask your Bible, where does the verb parad occur in your Hebrew Bible? And the first, here's how it works. The first use of it is in Genesis 2:10. It's the 4 rivers that come out of Eden. But then 10:5 of Genesis is the second use. From these, the coastland peoples spread, divided. Okay. 10:32 is the third use, that the peoples of the earth spread. What's interesting, though, and here's where a divine council worldview sometimes is called a Deuteronomy 32:8 worldview. Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Why is that? Flip up to Deuteronomy 32, which is a use of this Hebrew noun,
Yep.
divide. And I think here you have, at the end of Torah, Deuteronomy 32, the very end, Moses is recalling for his people the grand story, the grand narrative of what they are living through. And here you go. Verse 32, Deuteronomy 32:8. When the Most High, understood God, Most High God, which would be Yahweh, gave to the nations their inheritance, when he parad mankind, when he divided mankind, there's that same verb used from Genesis 32:10 or 10:32. When he divided mankind, so you might as well just write in, this is Genesis 10:32 in Deuteronomy 32:8. What 32:8 adds to the story that we didn't really know as a reader in Deuteronomy in Genesis 10 is this, 32:8, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of the gods, the sons of God. And ESV has sons of God, King James has sons of Israel. We'll get there in time and talk about that textual issue. But the point is, most versions, including Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint, and so forth, read this way. That when God, and those of you that know the Divine Council Worldview story, this will be old hat to you. For those of you who are listening who don't really know what a Divine Council Worldview even is, this is it right here. That in Deuteronomy 32:8, with Moses recalling the story of everything up to that point in Torah, in biblical history, in the mind of an Israelite, here's what happened. When God divided the earth in Genesis 10:32, and specifically in the life of Peleg, Genesis 10:25, it was during his days that this is what happened. And I take it to be the Tower of Babel incident, which we'll get to next time, that God, in a sense, divided the world, yes, by speech patterns, but really what he did, when you think about it in a vertical sense, what is he doing vertically, not just horizontally? He's dividing the world into, fascinating thought here, the authority of divine beings. He's giving authority to different divine beings. That's what we mean by the end of 32:8. He fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of divine beings. Oh, so now what we have, not just speech patterns, not just tribalism. We have these tribes who are being divided out by the God they worship. I think that's the point that 32:8 and 9 are trying to get to. That by the time you get to the end of now go back and read Genesis 10 this way. It's not just speech patterns that are making a difference at the end of Genesis 10. It's not just where you live. It's not, the guy around the hill that you don't like because he doesn't talk like you do. That's not the bigger issue that's going on. What's really happening is that when you go around the hill to the other people over there, they're worshiping a different deity. And that's where Deuteronomy 32:8 is going to make its mark in so much of the biblical story. So take it from there, Mike. I mean, I know you're itching to talk, but any thoughts there as we get close to closing this one up?
So I guess it begs the question, right? Based on Deuteronomy 32:8 and also on Genesis 10:32, so I guess from the way that you described it, would it be fair to say that from your perspective, you believe that the sons of God at the time of 1032 were already rebelling, that they were sort of carrying out this injustice in some sense of them drawing people away, drawing human beings away from the worship of Yahweh to the worship of themselves?
Yeah. Obviously, that's a huge question that will be driving our conversation for podcasts to come. But let me give you my opinion, and I'm aware of Mike's opinion. God bless him for what he did to help us think through this on his time. Let me give you my opinion, and then let's close with your opinion. In my opinion, 1032, we don't know yet. That would be how I would, at least as a reader of a story, like a novel from left to right, like The Gun on the Mantle, I don't know yet how this is going to play out. So I would say, for my reading of the Bible, I'm going to wait to answer the question of a rebellion to see what happens. Okay, fair enough. And then secondly, by the time you get, see, here's the thing. By the time you get to Psalm 82, right? We have Yahweh speaking to these beings, very upset at them, judging them, promising that they will be punished. So at that point, I'm being torn because I don't want to get too far ahead in the story and then retrofit everything backwards into it.
That's fair.
On the same hand, having read the Bible, we have a view that we have to, in some sense, go back and read it with that view in hand. There's that test driving idea. So I would say for the listener, for the reader of Genesis 10 that's listening to this podcast, for example, how about we go into Genesis 11 next time with the understanding only that what God is doing is dividing the earth into people groups, nations, and languages, and that they will be worshiping other deities besides Yahweh. I think we can do that based on Canaan's story, the blessed be Shem's story at the end of 9. In other words, reading the text left to right, I still think we can fairly read Genesis 10 with the understanding that these people groups are not worshiping the Most High God. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. I do wonder, like, how, I guess part of my question and the motivation behind that is how intricate or how, like, deeply, like, how conscious of a decision was it of them worshiping these other deities, right? Like, did they, did they have like a fork in the road moment of I must choose one way or the other, or was it just almost like a slow osmosis process of just over time? Well, I guess this is the deity that's just made known to my people, and there's no way to connect back to Yahweh. And so I guess that's
save that for next time, because I will be quoting from John Walton's study Bible, where he gets into how did people choose their deity question. It's a well, and I'm going to borrow it because it's extremely well said. And to quickly give a response to that idea, my understanding, reading as much as I can from the ancient world, was that you basically inherited the deity of your father and the grandfather. In other words, these are tribal deities that you grew up, worshiping. And so your question's a good one. Did you come to a fork in the road moment where you chose to worship one deity over another? That's clearly what's going to happen in Genesis 12. But before that time, do we have evidence that people, when they're 18, they said, Dad, I'm going to worship Molech because I don't like Chemosh, that kind of thing. The evidence is that they didn't generally do that you stuck with your tribal deity because that's the one that took care of you. And if you're going to go against him, my goodness, what kind of fool would do that, except if you married across the tribal lines, maybe, and now you took your husband's deity, whatever. But it's a great question. I think we can let it go for this podcast and introduce it in 10 or in 11 and especially 12. So how about we do that?
I think that's fine. And I'll probably bring up another question while we get into 11. It goes back to a little bit of some of that research from Peter Gentry and Catherine McDowell. So I'll save that for the next episode.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, everyone. Let's call it call it a day for Genesis chapter 10. And I hope again that you can keep joining us for really what is going to again drive the story of the gospel. So we'll see you next time.